From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
My name is Nicholas Brown, and I am a concert producer and the lead producer for today's events. And we really appreciate your being here and also for the concert today. A few things to mention about today's program. It is a special presentation put on by Concerts from the Library of Congress in conjunction with a library-wide initiative named Songs of America. And this is a incredibly large, massive, multiple year-long project which is looking at presenting American history through song for educational purposes and also for the general public. The Civil War in America is an exhibit run by the Interpretive Programs Office and done in collaboration with all of the divisions of the library. I just want to thank my colleagues from IPO, Cheryl Riggin and Susan Morden, and then also Michelle Crowell, who is here with us, and she's one of the lead curators of the exhibit. And it's truly an amazing glimpse into history in a way that the Library of Congress can only provide. And also, this panel and concert are being presented in conjunction with the White House Historical Association, obviously a relevant organization to anything having to do with the White House, and especially the Civil War era. And we're very pleased to have Elise Kirk, who is Director Emeritus from the White House Historical Association, here with us. And also thank Maria Downs, who is in the leadership at White House Historical, for making this possible. And last but not least, the President's Own United States Marine Band has been a vital component in the planning stages of this project and also in everything you're going to see and hear today. I'd like to thank Master Gunnery Sergeant Mike Ressler and Colonel Michael Colburn for helping make this possible. And you will hear certainly more from both of them today. Just a bit of housekeeping. There will be a book signing immediately following the panel in this room. Christian McWhirter and Elise Kirk will sign copies of their books up here for a few minutes. The books are available for sale in the back if you're interested. And some of those books are out of print, so I would recommend getting them now if you want those specific ones. And then just to introduce a bit about our wonderful panelists. And as a musicologist and performer, I'm so excited to be able to introduce these people to you. This is a blockbuster lineup of American music scholars, particular to the Civil War. And you're in for a huge treat today. First up will be Christian McWhirter. He is an assistant editor of the Papers of Abraham Lincoln and a specialist in 19th century social and cultural history. He received his doctorate from the University of Alabama in 2009. He has contributed to the New York Times Disunion blog, Civil War Monitor, and the Blackwell's Companion series. His first book, Battle Hymns, The Power and Popularity of Music in the Civil War, examines the role of music in Civil War America and is a selection of the History Book Club. Christian will be giving a broad overview of music in the Civil War to give us some context for the close readings that we're going to get from our other panelists. Master Gunnery Sergeant Mike Ressler is a native of Pennsylvania. He joined the President's Own United States Marine Band in 1974. And he is the most senior active duty enlisted Marine in the entire United States Marine Corps. He is a trombone player as well as a euphonium player and a graduate of Westchester State University of Pennsylvania. He became chief librarian of the President's Own in 1988, and his current role is as historian of the President's Own United States Marine Band. In that role, he is responsible for researching the band's long and storied history and managing the historic archives of the Marine Band. Elise Kirk is an award-winning author, lecturer, and musicologist. Her written works have appeared in Opera News, White House History, the Cambridge Companion to 20th Century Opera, American Music, and other publications. Her books include American Opera, Musical Highlights from the White House, and Music at the White House, A History of the American Spirit. That last selection won the Deems-Taylor ASCAP Award. As a presidential appointee, Dr. Kirk served on the National Advisory Board of the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts and was a primary consultant for the documentary The White House, In Tune with History, which continues to air on PBS. As a member of the advisory board of the New Grove Dictionary of American Music, Dr. Kirk has a seminal role in terms of the scholarship of American music and dissemination of that as well. And as mentioned previously, she is a director emeritus of the White House Historical Association. And Loris John Schissel is a senior music specialist here at the Library of Congress, in addition to being a conductor regularly with the Cleveland Orchestra. And during that time, he has produced and conducted concerts of American music at Severance Hall and the orchestra's summer home at the Blossom Music Center. Loris is also the founder and music director of the Virginia Grand Military Band, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. Loris has a catalog of over 400 published works, 400, and he's recorded over 200 compact disc recordings, which includes, I'm sure, digital formats as well. His scores as a composer have been heard regularly on PBS, and he scored 2 films for the FDR Presidential Library in Hyde Park, New York. It is such a thrill for us to have Loris on staff in the music division. And one of the things that our scholars and curators do here is we're all active parts in the scholarly community. And Loris recently co-authored a book with John Philip Sousa IV entitled John Philip Sousa's America, The Patriot's Life in Images and Words. And without further ado, I will turn this over to Christian McWhirter. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming, and thanks to the Library of Congress for hosting us. This is a real treat for me. I've only moved to DC a couple years ago, and I write about the Marine Band, obviously, in my book, and so it's going to be I've never actually heard the Marine Band except on TV, so it'll be a treat for me to actually see them in person performing, and not only, but performing the kinds of stuff I wrote about. When I first started writing the book, my impression was that music was everywhere during the Civil War, and I got this impression from Hollywood more than from history books. Historians have mentioned Civil War music in the past, but they've been it's more prevalent in popular representations of the war, the Ken Burns series and movies like Gettysburg, movies like Lincoln. And once I started looking into it, I realized that this was true. From looking at letters and diaries and memoirs, almost every letter collection and any of these sources at least had one mention of music. I don't think anyone went through the Civil War without mentioning music at least once in the things that they wrote. It was performed in all aspects of life. It was performed in parlor pianos at the home. It was performed by regimental bands in the armies, at political rallies, and of course it was also sung by slaves and runaways and freedmen. But what's astounding about these songs is how the emotional resonance they have, in some cases for us today. It's difficult to find other wars in the American experience with as many songs that still have resonance. Everyone here, if I was to play Dixie for you, or the Battle Hymn of the Republic, or Battle Cry of Freedom, When Johnny Comes Marching Home, you would recognize all of these songs, and you would probably know a little historical context for each of them. That's rare, and in some cases, too, it's rare because we remember them the way they remember them. For instance, Dixie was not originally written to be the Confederate anthem, but we all think of it as the Confederate anthem because the Confederates made it their anthem. We don't think of it as a minstrel tune that was written before the war even broke out. And so it's interesting the way these songs have such resonance for us today, and it's because they had such deep resonance for Americans during the Civil War. Songs were one of the most valuable ways for Americans to communicate ideas, and one of the ways that they used to understand the war. One of the key reasons for this is because music in the Civil War was less of a personal. Now we listen to music individually, or sometimes at a concert, but usually individually. And we usually don't participate with the performance at all either. We might sing along in our car, but we don't sing as a group when a song is performed. But during the 19th century, that wasn't the case. Music was often performed in groups. Everyone was expected to join in. And so it made music a very valuable way to communicate ideas. And literacy, of course, wasn't required. You could transmit this orally. You didn't have to know how to play an instrument. You didn't have to know how to read music. You didn't have to know how to read the English language. According to a magazine out of Princeton in February 1864, the author is discussing music, comparing it to other art forms. He said, "These other art forms have no power, exercise no influence over the lower classes of mankind, the uneducated world. They require a certain cultivation of the mind, which comparatively few possess. Whereas with music, how different. All are influenced by it. the high, the low, the rich, the poor, the educated, and the uneducated. And I would add the black and the white. A heart of stone is made to yield, and even inanimate objects seem to feel its power. Similarly, like I said, you don't need to have a lot of skill with music. A member of the 51st Indiana Regiment, William R. Hartpence, wrote down that soldiers enjoyed the music of the military bands, but our voices we had with us all the time. And when in camp or on the march, it was no uncommon thing for one to start a song and then for the whole regiment to join in the chorus. Each one was a master, and the less melody or mellowness a voice possessed, the greater reason it seemed for cultivating it. So you can see, I mean, these people are enthusiastically talking about the role of music in their society, and they're all capable of interacting with music. Soldiers were accustomed to singing. It wasn't like now if I asked one of you to get up and sing, you'd be reluctant to do so. The 19th century, you might not have been as reluctant to do so. You might have got up and sang. I also would have probably sang some of the songs I'm going to talk about today, which I have no intention of doing. Part of the reason for this is because the American music industry had really developed in the decades leading into the Civil War. One of the primary reasons for this is the availability of pianos. Since the American Revolution, pianos had been steadily decreasing in value in America, which is exceptional. This is not happening in the rest of the world. By the time the Civil War breaks out, there's about 110 piano manufacturers in the country. The largest and most successful of them is Chickering & Sons. By the middle of the Civil War in 1863, Chickering & Sons, which is in Boston, was producing 42 pianos a week. They employed 500 people. And they produced instruments that some believed rivaled the best of the European piano manufacturers. A quality piano at the Civil War was about $250, which adjusted for inflation is about $4,400 today. So it's an expensive item, but it's not out of reach for a middle-class family. But cheaper models could be purchased for as low as $100, which is about $1,750 today. And of course, if you didn't want to buy piano, guitars and melodeons and all kinds of other instruments were available. And again, this is exceptional. In Europe, particularly, pianos were primarily limited to the upper classes. So the fact that most Americans can afford a piano is a kind of democratizing aspect and is part of the reason why public singing is so common. Similarly, a sheet music industry builds up around this, selling cheap sheet music with lots of eager people to write for it. Lowell Mason starts selling hymn books in the 1830s and 40s. And is the first to realize that you can make a profit off of selling this kind of music. And the real success story is Stephen Foster, who wrote songs like Oh Susanna and Camptown Races, and for a time lived off of songwriting alone. It was his career. He was the first to effectively do so. And so around this, a parlor tradition develops, where middle-class and upper-class families would have a parlor in their home with a piano or some other musical instrument in it, which they would play at night, and they would gather around and they would sing together. And by this way, again, family singing and public singing gets disseminated. And then there's these other public venues like rallies and things like that. So when the war arrives, America's primed to want to interact with the war in a musical way. They want to deal with the issues of the war. They want to express their own ideas about the war. And a lot of them are going to look to music to do so. 1 year into the war, the Saturday Evening Post declares that a, quote, flood of new songs has greeted the war. The Chicago song music publisher, Root and Katie, one of the most successful wartime song publishers, reports that they received between 50 to 70 new submissions a day. Around 9,000 and 10,000 different songs were published during the Civil War, a small number of that in the Confederacy, about 600 to 700. Because of the blockade. But even in the Confederacy with those small numbers, music outstripped every other form of literature except for newspapers. And these are just different songs. I'm not talking about the actual pieces of sheet music, just different individual songs. Furthermore, because these songs are being performed in groups, and because everyone is getting their own sheet music and being able to sing it, or they're learning it orally, everyone gets to put their own spin on these songs. We don't think of these songs, don't think of them as static the way we would a song today. If I were to name a prominent song to you, like Jailhouse Rock by Elvis Presley, you would all hear the exact same version of Jailhouse Rock in your head that I just heard, because you've heard it on the radio. You've heard Elvis sing it. People then didn't have these kind of ultimate versions of songs. They would perform them themselves. Most had never heard the song published by the songwriter. In fact, some songwriters, like Foster, rarely performed their own songs. So everyone would have their own version. So these songs would go through these transformations. The the best example of this during the war is the song John Brown's Body. John Brown's Body is written by soldiers, members of the 2nd Massachusetts Battalion. They based it on a revival hymn of unknown origin called Say Brothers Will You Meet Us on Canaan's Happy Shore. They write it as an inside joke about a sergeant named John Brown in their regiment, and it becomes phenomenally popular. It's now written by a professional songwriter, it's written by soldiers, becomes, I argue, the most popular patriotic song in the North, and of course gets converted by Julia Ward Howe just down the street to the Battle Hymn of the Republic at the end of 1862, which then becomes popular, I found, at the end of the war and afterwards. But this is all the same song. This is all just people performing the same song and putting their own spin on it. Granted, we now think of the Battle Hymn of the Republic as being kind of the ultimate form of that song. The Battle Hymn of the Republic was just one of many revisions, some of which got written down, some of which didn't. Part of what made John Brown's Body so popular among soldiers and civilians is that they could put their own spin on it. You could make up your own lyrics. It's a very simple song. So the fact these songs could then be, they're so malleable, people could use them in a variety of ways. They could use them to express political opinions. They could use them to resist authority. Confederate women used music to resist Union occupation. Slaves used music to resist their masters and then to express their freedom once they achieved it. And so all of this combines to make the Civil War sort of a war fought to music. Going into the Civil War, the most popular genre of music in America were ballads, sentimental pieces, these sort of romantic songs. These tend to deal with subjects dealing with separation, sweethearts separated, and so going into the Civil, and death actually was big in them too. Going into the Civil War, these were a very popular genre. The most popular song in America before, during, and after the Civil War was probably Home Sweet Home, which is a good example of this sort of song. Similarly, going into the Civil War, The Girl I Left Behind Me is popular during the war, which is a pre-war song that has the same kind of, it's a soldier remembering the girl he left at home. The top-selling sentimental song of the war was Weeping Sad and Lonely, or When This Cruel War Is Over, which has these same, it's a couple with the soldier saying he's going to go enlist and telling his sweetheart that they will reunite when this cruel war is over. It was written by Charles Carroll Sawyer, who's noteworthy because he was the only songwriter that I found who actually put his name on sheet music when it sold in the Confederacy and the Union. I don't know how he pulled this off, but both sides, they didn't recognize each other's copyright, so they were frequently publishing each other's songs and claiming they were their own. But Sawyer, for some reason, manages to get his name on the sheet music on both sides. He's Northerner. He's from New York. He publishes his own music, actually. But it was very popular on both sides. There was a Confederate and a Union version. They changed the color of the uniforms and the lyrics. And by the end of the 19th century, it had sold about 1 million copies. So this is a huge hit. And again, that's just sales. This doesn't account for the amount of amateur songwriting that's also going on. However, although these sentimental songs are prominent going into the war, and although more sentimental songs are published during the war than any other kind of music, from reading the diaries and letters of soldiers during the war, newspaper reports, things like that, it's clear to me that patriotic or martial music was by far the most popular type of music during the Civil War. And that's because it fit the need of what people wanted more. What people wanted from their music in the Civil War was a way to interact with the issues of the war and the emotions of the war, and martial and patriotic songs did that better than sentimental songs did. The other reason is because this is a war we're talking about, and in a war there are soldiers. And not only are there soldiers, but there's mobile soldiers. Soldiers are marching all over the country. And as a result, the soldiers exerted an enormous influence on popular taste during the Civil War. The songs the soldiers liked were the songs everybody else eventually ended up liking. As these soldiers wind their way through the country, either as armies or in individual units, they're coming in contact with civilians, they're encamping near urban centers, and they're singing songs. And the people surrounding these camps are learning these songs. As the abolitionist and women's rights advocate and author Lydia Maria Child wrote, "Nothing on earth has such effect on popular heart as songs which the soldiers would take up with enthusiasm and which would thereby become the fashion to whistle and sing on street corners." And she was absolutely right. It's the patriotic songs the soldiers adapt, the marching tunes the soldiers adapt, have the greatest influence and are performed more often, I found, than any other form of music. Eventually, each side adopts two major anthems, two major war anthems. In the Union, of course, the Union already has the Star Spangled Banner isn't the official national anthem during the Civil War. There's about 5 contenders to be the national anthem during the Civil War. So these are more war anthems as opposed to their national anthems, but 2 main war anthems emerge in the North, and those are John Brown's Body and the Battle Cry of Freedom. In the Confederacy, where they have to find a national anthem, 2 contenders emerge, and that's Dixie and the Bonnie Blue Flag, neither of which the Confederates are entirely happy with, but that will have to stay on the shelf for now. And so these songs become enormously popular and in a lot of ways characterize the music of the war. And there's all kinds of other examples that I could cite. I'm running low on time, so just to close off, and to bring it back to the Marine Band, where the rest of this discussion is going to go, the Marine Band as a prominent military musical band, its experiences during the war exemplify many of the things I just talked about. Mary Lincoln at one point cancels their free weekly concerts, and the members of the public protest because they want this music. They want ways to listen to the martial music that they're used to. But the Marine Band didn't play as much martial music. There's also a conflict that goes on over the kinds of music the Marine Band will play. There's a conflict in the 19th century between this higher, more cultured music and the low popular music, which is the kind that I'm talking about. And there's a real argument that takes place over whether the Marine Band should play more of these popular airs, because the public demands it. But the Marine Band wants to play more kind of cultured, or what we would today call classical music. And the members of the public that go to these free concerts, they want to hear more of the kinds of songs that they're used to, being John Brown's Body, the Battle Cry of Freedom, or the anthems like Yankee Doodle and the Star Spangled Banner. So all these illustrate, again, this demand for popular music and this demand for martial music, and the way music became central to the way many Americans experienced and interacted with the Civil War. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I, too, want to thank the Library of Congress for involving the Marine Band in this observation of the Civil War in America. I would like to begin by asking you to think back to the year 1868. That may be a little difficult. You have to use your imagination. But if in 1868, a 13-year-old prodigy hadn't threatened to run away from home to join a circus band, and if the leader of the Marine Band at that time hadn't accepted him into the apprentice music program, and if this young man hadn't later become the director of the United States Marine Band, and then went on to have a very successful career as a conductor and a composer, then we might know the name Francis Maria Scala a whole lot better than we do today. That young man that I was talking about was John Philip Sousa, and the leader of the Marine Band who accepted him as a music apprentice was Francis Scala. Scala was, without question, one of the most important and influential directors of the Marine Band, and he made lasting and significant changes to the band, but his accomplishments were dwarfed by Sousa. Scala was a visionary leader, seeing possibilities for the development of the Marine Band which his predecessors hadn't seen. He was a talented and serious musician, and unsatisfied with the state of the band, labored to implement changes which would change the course of the band, putting it on a trajectory for growth, development, and success. Scala was a giant, but he stands today in Sousa's shadow. We can only wonder if the blazing light of fame would have shone so brightly on Sousa if Scala hadn't done his work first. Who was Scala, and what did he find when he joined the Marine Band? Well, he was born in Naples, Italy, around 1820. He received formal training at what he called the Musical College in Naples. It was the Naples Conservatory. Scala probably studied there in the mid to late 1830s, and I'm just estimating that. But certainly he received a world-class conservatory education there. If he graduated about 1840, and again I'm just guessing, he was exposed to a lot of great Italian opera before he departed Italy. All of the operas of Rossini and Bellini would have been written and premiered, and most of the operas of Donizetti. About 1841, when Scala was 20 or 21 years old, he boarded the U.S. naval frigate Brandywine while it was anchored at Naples, and he enlisted into the U.S. Navy as a third-class musician. In a newspaper interview published in 1896, he explained that he spoke no English at all, but the executive officer of the Brandywine spoke fluent Italian, and he enticed him to join the ship's band. Within 1 month, he had been placed in charge of that band. Months later, the ship headed across the Atlantic for Norfolk. Scala experienced severe seasickness on the trip, and shortly after arriving in Norfolk, he secured his discharge from the Navy. He made his way to Washington, D.C., which seemed to be away from most water, and he enlisted in the Marine Corps. This was on August 11, 1842, for duty with the United States Marine Band. In the 1896 newspaper interview, Scala described the band of 1842. Quote, "It wasn't much of an organization then. Congress had made no provision for the band so that the 10 or 12 members were enlisted as fifers or drummers, there being 2 leaders, a fife major and a drum major." Now, Scala was correct in saying that there was no money authorized by Congress to fund the band. This had been true since the band's founding. The Commandant of the Marine Corps collected $10 from each of his officers to create a music fund enabling the enlistment of the earliest musicians. Creative funding must have been used to support the band and procure instruments. Returning to Scala's 1896 interview, he described the band as, quote, "a small reed affair. We had 1 flute, 1 clarinet, 1 French horn, 2 trombones, 1 bugle, 1 bass drum, 1 small drum, and 1 cymbal player. The nations represented in the band's makeup were America, England, Germany, Spain, Italy, and Austria. Why, the bass drummer couldn't read music, and while I led the band with my clarinet, I directed the drummer by stamping my feet." We don't have to do that anymore. Scala's memory may be called into question somewhat. He claimed to have become the leader of the band in 1842 or 1843, while John Tyler was president. He may have been given some leadership responsibilities, or he may have been named the fife major of the band as early as 1843. The band had just begun giving regular public concerts at the U.S. Capitol, and concerts at the White House grounds began no later than the summer of 1841. A very brief review, dated July 28, 1841, in the Jeffersonian Republic, stated, quote, "The music of the Marine Band in the grounds of the President's house last evening was very fine," end quote. So the quality of the band's performances may have been just a bit better than we are led to believe by Scala's comments, which were made more than 50 years later. Although there may be some question as to Scala's official status in the early years, we know that he became the leader of the band in 1855. Less than 2 years after being named leader, he and the Marine Band participated in the inaugural of President James Buchanan. Buchanan was a bachelor, and he called upon his niece, Harriet Lane, who he raised from childhood, to serve as his official White House hostess. Buchanan was described as possessing engaging social qualities, and it's no surprise that the social calendar at the White House was quite full. Scala remembered, quote, "During the Buchanan administration, Miss Harriet Lane took a lively interest in the musical end of her uncle's administration as part of the social feature. The march played at Buchanan's inauguration I dedicated to Miss Lane, and it had already made a heavy sale. I, of course, saw all of the famous men who took part in the making of history just previous to the outbreak of the rebellion. It was Harriet Lane who was extremely helpful to Scala in expanding the size of the band. Scala explained her involvement. Quote, Miss Lane was the lady of the White House in this administration, and she was fond of social life. The band had plenty to do. It was at the White House several times a week. I asked Miss Lane to have something done to have the band enlarged, and so she appealed to the president with success. This was the beginning of the Marine Band as it is today. It was doubled in strength, and all kinds of instruments were added to it, end quote. The instrumentation of the band was steadily growing. A document from 1840 listed the band's instruments as flutes, E-flat clarinet, B-flat clarinets, bugle, trumpet with valves, French horns, trombone, ophicleide, bass horn, Turkish bells, and cymbals. An arrangement made by Scala's predecessor in the Marine Band, Raphael Trier, in 1848, of the music of Verdi's 1842 opera Nabucco, showed strong influences of the Italian musical culture. The instruments used by Trier included E-flat ottavinos, ottavines, E-flat clarinet, B-flat clarinets, bugle, E-flat trumpet, hippocorno, E-flat corny, cornopian in A-flat, trombones, ophicleide, bass, percussion, terzino, and clavichord. 10 years later, 1858, the Marine Band's instrumentation included a piccolo, flutes, E-flat clarinet, B-flat clarinets, E-flat cornet, E-flat trumpet, cornopians, ippocorni, an early kind of cornet, French horns, baritones, trombones, tubas, and percussion, very close to our instrumentation today. I should point out that he didn't go the way of most bands of the Civil War era, eliminating most or all of the woodwinds. He maintained a full section of woodwind instruments. A major event occurred in 1860, and the Marine Band was prominently involved. The Prince of Wales visited the United States. Scala described it in an interview. Quote, the big social event of the Buchanan administration was the visit here of the Prince of Wales. He was a guest at the White House during his stay in the Capitol. I had to report every morning at the White House to Miss Lane and receive directions as to the various music for the day. President Buchanan took the prince to visit the tomb of George Washington at Mount Vernon, and Scala created a special arrangement of the Miserere from Verdi's Il Trovatore for the occasion. He commented, quote, as the distinguished visitors stood at the grave of the father of his country, the band played a funeral dirge which I had arranged for the occasion. As the music swelled forth, the Prince of Wales, standing at the side of the President of the United States, raised his hat, and every head was soon uncovered. As I played, I turned and saw tears running down the cheeks of Buchanan, end quote. This was a significant moment in Scala's life. The increase in personnel authorized by President Buchanan was made permanent on July 25, 1861, when President Lincoln signed an act of Congress reorganizing the Marine Corps and officially establishing the Marine Band by law. The bill authorized one principal musician, one drum major, and 30 musicians. This tripled the size of the band which Scala had joined in 1842. Now the band was firmly established by law and in the musical and social life of Washington, as well as in its role of providing music for the president. The band was a regular part of receptions, levees, and dinners at the White House, and the relationship between the band and Lincoln was close. They traveled with Lincoln to Gettysburg in November of 1863 for the dedication of the National Cemetery, and they were witnesses of Lincoln's presentation of the Gettysburg Address. A discussion of Scala's contributions to the Marine Band must include mention of his development of the band's repertoire. In the late 1830s, the repertoire was comprised primarily of reworkings of the old fife tunes from the band's earliest days, sentimental ballads, and some newer popular and patriotic music. Scala expanded on this with his own original compositions and arrangements from orchestral repertoire and popular operas. The Scala music collection is filled with music by familiar names such as Auber, Bellini, Donizetti, Flotow, Gounod, Meyerbeer, Offenbach, Strauss, and Verdi. All the leading composers are represented. His own original compositions included titles such as President Lincoln's Inaugural March, also known as the Union March, the Ladies' Polka, and an arrangement of the Soldiers' Duet from Gounod's opera Geneviève de Bourbon, which is the musical source of the Marines' hymn. A number of these titles are on display in the room behind me. I hope you'll take time to look at those. On February 4th, 1862, President Lincoln summoned Scala to the White House to meet Mrs. Lincoln to discuss the music which was to be performed the following night at a gala ball, the first event of its kind ever held at the White House, with over 500 invited guests. I don't have a complete list of the music that was used that evening, but a partial list includes two of Scala's original compositions and selections from Masaniello, Un ballo in maschera, Lucia de Lammermoor, Il Trovatore, La Traviata, and I Vespri Siciliani. Scala received criticism for the repertoire of the band. The most stinging criticism came from none other than Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy. On July 11, 1863, he wrote in his personal diary, quote, I directed Colonel Harris, he was the commandant, a few days since to instruct the Marine Band, when performing on public days, to give us more martial and national music, end quote. In the ensuing public discussion, John Nicolay, the president's secretary, objected, saying he wanted, quote, more finished music to cultivate and refine the popular taste, German and Italian, etc. Wells continued writing in his diary, quote, this music was unsuited to most of our fighting men, inspired no hearty zeal or rugged purpose. Martial music, not operatic airs, are best adapted to all. Well, President Lincoln, fortunately, came to Scala's aid. Even though his personal tastes may have been more rugged than refined, Lincoln appreciated Scala's efforts to improve the band, and he attended concerts whenever he could. Of the presidents that Scala served, he was probably closest to Lincoln, and he claimed to have many personal souvenirs of him. The president's death must have been a terrible personal loss, suddenly ending a friendship and a close working relationship. Scala left the Marine Band in 1871 and retired to his home on South Carolina Avenue in Southeast Washington. He lived there for the rest of his life and died on December 13th, 1903. At the funeral, the Marine Band performed the arrangement of the Miserere, which Scala had conducted at Washington's tomb over 40 years earlier. Following the funeral service, he was buried in Congressional Cemetery. For the funeral procession, the Marine Band performed Barnard's funeral march dedicated to the memory of Abraham Lincoln. Scala expanded the band, tripling its size. He modernized its instrumentation, broadened its repertoire, established the band as a fixture at diplomatic and social events at the White House, and developed a concert ensemble that received great critical acclaim, including reviews from the pen of a government clerk and poet named Walt Whitman. When he retired in 1871, he left an organization that was tremendously different from the one he had joined in 1842, one that was poised to go on to much greater heights, greater than even this visionary could imagine. Even though his contributions have been eclipsed, Scala was one of the most important and influential directors of the United States Marine Band, and he deserves his day in the spotlight. Thank you very much.
Oh, good afternoon. It's such a pleasure being here. Just so wonderful. I have such marvelous memories of researching for many, many years in the Library of Congress and have only praise for the wonderful, magnificent, really, staff and resources in working on my book, which is a history of music in the White House, mainly the performers who entertained for the presidents from George Washington right through to modern times. So thank you to the library. As you reign in peace, pure goddess, spread peace across the earth. When Maida Blanchard sang these words from Bellini's Norma for President Lincoln in the White House, the first gun had been fired against Fort Sumter only 3 months earlier. The performance so thrilled Lincoln that he sent the young American singer a bouquet of flowers. Excited and humbled, Maida Blanchard could never have realized that she was inaugurating a long, ongoing tradition, opera in the White House. For since her performance for Lincoln, hundreds of singers have entertained at important White House functions for virtually every president. Music binds together young and old, great and humble, but it also humanizes the presidency. It allows us to reach into the souls of hardened leaders and come to know them in a way unlike any other. In the days before radio, movies, and TV, Americans depended upon live theater for their entertainment, and opera was the supreme spectacle of the day. We might say Giuseppe Verdi was the Stephen Sondheim of the mid-19th century. But even more captivating were the singers. Audiences knew their favorite stars as we admire our pop icons today. President Millard Fillmore enjoyed the glittering Swedish nightingale Jenny Lind when she sang in Washington. And Rutherford Hayes invited to the White House the young black singer Marie Salaika. She stunned his guests with her amazing interpretation of Verdi's Ernani in Volami. For Abraham Lincoln, opera was both a diversion and a joy. Lincoln, in fact, was one of America's most unmusical presidents. He could neither read music, play an instrument, nor carry a tune. Yet few presidents in history have been as responsive to music's lyrical powers. Wartime songs and sentimental ballads touched Lincoln deeply, and friends recall that certain tunes would, quote, mist his eyes with tears and throw him into a fit of deep melancholy, unquote. Opera, too, could have an emotional effect on Lincoln, especially the Marine Band's spirited arrangements from the most popular composers of the day. Bellini, Boieldieu, Donizetti, Weber, Meyerbeer, Gounod, Rossini, Verdi. All composers whose operas Lincoln saw in the theaters of Washington. Lincoln's enthusiasm for opera was so pronounced, in fact, that the New York Herald suggested he visit Manhattan, quote, where Mrs. Lincoln can shop and the president can have his fill of opera, unquote. But the president did not have to go to New York to see opera. Touring companies such as New York's Academy of Music, founded in 1854, had their regular seasons in the nation's capital. I was amazed to discover that Lincoln saw at least 30 fully staged productions of opera during his 4-year tenure in the White House. Sometimes he even saw the same performance several times. When he was criticized for his frequent attendance at the theater during the ravages of the war, he replied simply, I must have a change or I will die. And how many of us have felt this way and turned to music as a kind of therapy? We know it can work wonders. It was in New York, however, that Lincoln saw his first opera. On February 20th, 1851, 2 weeks before his inauguration, he attended Verdi's Un ballo in maschera, a masked ball. This was during his the American premiere run. It was conducted by Emanuele Muzio, Verdi's former pupil and lifelong friend, and had received its world premiere in Rome only 2 years earlier. To honor the president-elect, Muzio asked the cast and orchestra to perform the Star-Spangled Banner as Lincoln was entering the theater. But because the singers were European, only 2 young Americans knew the words. The enterprising Adelaide Phillips, you see here, and she later formed her own opera company. And also Isabella Hinckley, who appeared in the opera in the role of the page. For Abraham Lincoln, however, Verdi's dramatic opera about the assassination of a national leader became a chilling prophecy. 4 years later, as we know, Lincoln's own assassination was enacted with tragic realism in another theater, this time in the nation's capital. The operas that Lincoln saw in Washington as president were elaborately staged with scenery, costumes, famous singers, and full orchestra. Some were produced at Ford's Theater, but most at Grover's National Theater, with its larger stage, 2,000-seat capacity, and elegantly frescoed interior. I just have to add that is today's National Theater, but it had been renovated and changed many times. At Grover's, Lincoln always occupied his colorfully festooned presidential box, either with Mrs. Lincoln and some of their friends or alone, as on the night he saw Beethoven's Fidelio featuring the great German soprano Bertha Johansson as Leonora. And I should add, she appears here in her portrait gown. That's not her costume from the opera. The president's opera nights, of course, always made news when he attended scenes from Verdi's Il Trovatore and Bellini's I Puritani on January 22nd, 1862. The press noted that, quote, the theater was crowded to its utmost capacity, and the president, on being observed in one of the boxes, received a hearty and prolonged applause from the audience. President Lincoln received the same attention when he had appeared at other productions also, such as Bellini's Norma on April 22nd, 1863, and later that year, Rossini's Barbara of Seville with the highly praised tenor Pasquale Brignoli, that you see here. He played Count Almaviva. Oh, the critics loved him. They adored Brignoli. This is what one said. He stands before the footlights with the greatest indifference to pose. But when he opens his voice to sing, all this is forgotten. Only 2 weeks earlier, the president and Mrs. Lincoln were honored at a performance of von Weber's Der Freischütz, in which Theodor Habelmann sang the role of Max. The popular tenor would make history 2 years later as Walter in Washington premiere of Wagner's Tannhäuser. But Habelmann was also respected for the many benefit concerts he gave for sick and wounded soldiers during the war. What I found particularly fascinating, we don't think of this about our city, realize this about our city. Most all of the operas Lincoln attended were Washington premieres. So the audiences at that time were treated to the newest shows in town. Ironically, one of the most important of these, Tannhäuser, America's first Wagner opera, Lincoln did not see. He was ill the day of the performance, March 14th, 1865, and he had to meet his cabinet in his bedroom. Nothing could stop the president from going to the opera the next night, though. This was for Mozart's Die Zauberflöte, the magic flute. He would not miss his favorite basso, Joseph Hermann's, as Zarastro, and especially the brilliant young Hungarian soprano, Johanna Rauter, as Queen of the Night. But perhaps the most moving performance that Lincoln saw was Donizetti's lively Daughter of the Regiment. Staged on May 28, 1862, the production shows how powerfully opera and audience could interact when tormented by devastation and war. And I kind of think about Dr. McVirter's comments about the way music relates, brings people together. And this is one interesting example. And also the way performers improvised. So this production was featured in this production was the young American soprano Clara Louise Kellogg. This is her picture. She sang the role of Marie, and she relates in her memoirs how the cast added American national tunes and drum rolls to the score to turn the opera's original French setting into an American pageant. The audience cheered and cried, she writes. They let themselves go in the manner of people wrought up by great national excitements. Even on the stage, we caught the feeling. I sang the Filia better than I had ever sung anything yet. And I found myself wondering as I sang how many of my cadet friends of a few months earlier were already on the front. Clara Louise Kellogg was only 19 when Lincoln heard her, and she had made her operatic debut as Gilda in Rigoletto at New York's Academy of Music just a few months earlier. While Kellogg was from South Carolina, most of the singing stars in those days were from overseas. The famous contralto, Felicita Westphali, for example, was from what is today Poland. Westphali the Magnificent, as she was affectionately called, was not only a superior actress, but an early champion for the rights of gays and lesbians. In opera, she was famous especially for her trouser roles. Notably, Romeo in Bellini's I Cappelletti di Montecchi, and Orsini in Donizetti's Lucrezia Borgia. The popular Westphali so captivated President and Mrs. Lincoln, in fact, that in early 1864, they attended 4 of her performances in less than 2 weeks. But the biggest news in opera came in the springs of 1864 and 1865, when the so-called German troupe came to Washington. The celebrated team was directed by Karl Anschutz, teacher of the American conductor Theodore Thomas, who I have to add was the founder of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Although today they are mere history, these singers were the best and experienced in America, and according to the press, they were extremely popular. There is no greater ensemble than this troupe of Fords, wrote the National Intelligencer, and there are no more perfect artists. Lincoln apparently agreed because he saw Marie Frederici and Franz Himmer in Gounod's Faust at least twice. We see them here as Lincoln probably did in their costumes for Marguerite and Faust. Now, Faust, of course, was sensationally popular in America after its New York premiere in 1863. Only 6 months later, it came to Washington and became the newest rage in town. We have had Faust with its greatest representation now on any stage, boasted the Washington press. although the spirited soldiers' chorus annoyed the reviewer, apparently it was played as an encore, but this march was President Lincoln's favorite operatic piece, the soldiers' chorus. Faust, of course, retains its popularity today, and the role of Mephistopheles is still one of the most famous in all opera. We recognize here the great modern Mephistopheles, Sam Raimi. Lincoln, though, enjoyed the extraordinary performance of Joseph Hermans from Her Majesty's Theatre in London. According to one account, the great basso as Mephistopheles totally astounded American audiences. With his glittering icy eyes, the gliding, shuffling gait, the writhing mockery of everything pure and good, he was the incarnation of evil. Apparently, one of Herman's intensely dramatic effects was to use a sustained and perfect trill just before gliding into his fiendish laugh. After seeing Hermans in this electrifying role, President Lincoln promptly invited the popular basso to the White House. I'd like to know more details about that. I wonder if he sang. The opera season had scarcely ended at Grover's in mid-March 1865, when, not to be outdone, Ford's Theater announced several weeks of its own productions. But although he had secured boxes at Ford's for several upcoming events, Lincoln would never see them. His last opera was Boileau's romantic La Dame Blanche, the White Lady. This was on March 21st, 1865. "We went to the opera on Saturday Eve," Mrs. Lincoln wrote in her New York friend, quote, "Mr. Lincoln, when he throws off his heavy manner, as he often does, can make himself very, very agreeable. Last evening, he again joined our little coterie, and tomorrow eve we go again to hear Robin Adair sung in La Dame Blanche by Hubelmann." 3 weeks later, Lincoln was dead. What must Washington have been like during the horrors of the Civil War? It had to have been a city of coffins and sickbeds, because its 21 hospitals were filled with more than 50,000 soldiers. But it was also a city without modern diversions. The theater was a panacea, a way to forget, if only for a moment. But for Abraham Lincoln, it was much more. Quote, "Listening to melody," he once said, "every man becomes his own poet and measures the depth of his own nature, though he is apt to lose the line as the sound dies away." And Lincoln continues, "As a student in a rugged school, I have been through life obliged to strip ideas of their ornaments and make them facts before I conquered them. Still, a few soft, heart-searching notes will often remind me of a want, convincing me that, like other hard workers, I may have gained in precision and concentration at the cost, maybe, of the silent pleasure an eye educated to beauty can always drink in at a glance." It's a wonderful, wonderful quote. It tells us so much about Lincoln, but it also tells us much about ourselves, about early America, and about today. For music will always be a vital part of the American adventure of discovery, reinforcing our heritage and, as Lincoln reminds us, glorifying our dreams. Thank you very much.
Schissel from the music division, and I want to keep my remarks brief so that you folks can have a chance to ask questions or make comments to our wonderful panel we have up here. But I basically tossed out my prepared comments when Nick made the introduction for this group. And I'm reminded I've been here at the library for over 22 years now, and one of my duties is to take care of the Francis Scala Archive, which I hope before the concert starts you'll have a few moments to see my colleague Mr. Ray White's wonderful display of Scala and Lincoln and Copeland and other sorts of things that are out on display. These are all the original things you see out there. But I was reminded of one of my favorite stories about being here at the Library of Congress, and it sort of fits with this crowd. And above us here in the historic Jefferson Building, one floor up, is the ceremonial office of the Librarian of Congress, a very ornate and beautiful office that now that we have the Madison Building off across the street has become sort of the place where awards are given or dignitaries are received. And it was during Dan Worston's time as Librarian of Congress that he would come over here and give an award or meet a head of state in the office there. And it always caught his attention that there was a large walk-in safe in the ceremonial office. And each time he saw that, he would ask one of his assistants, he said, "What's in there?" And the assistants always said, "Oh, nothing. We haven't used that safe in decades. There's nothing in there." A few weeks later, Dan would come back and give an award or meet another head of state, and he'd say, "Are you sure there's nothing in there?" And after the third request about making sure there wasn't anything in that safe, he said, "Why don't you call the locksmith and have that opened up? I just want to make sure there's nothing in there." And so the locksmith was promptly acquired, brought here to the library. The door was swung open. One of these tall sort of bank vault doors, hadn't been opened in 60 years, opens up like this. Inside there's just one box on a shelf, tied up with string, little label, you know, the old-fashioned kind with the little string that you can attach. And in an old script, it said on this box, "Contents of my father's pockets the night he was assassinated in Ford's Theater." So when you get a chance to come back to the library, I can only hope that you go upstairs and see our wonderful Civil War exhibit, which has the contents of Mr. Lincoln's pockets the night he was assassinated in Ford's Theater. And I always like to point out to people that in his wallet that he took with him to Ford's Theater that night, the only money he had on him that night was a $5 Confederate bill. But I think there's this wonderful sort of confluence of Lincoln and the Marine Band and the period of the Civil War. The building that we're in right now, us in the Supreme Court next door, actually in years past were apartments basically that you could rent out. And as a young congressman from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln lived on this block. And I'm often reminded of the charge we have for the great treasures that we have in the collections here at the Library of Congress, and the Scala collection being one of them. And I hope you'll, when you're looking at the display, see that beautiful little Abraham Lincoln card. But it's very easy to bring out a manuscript of Johann Sebastian Bach or Johannes Brahms or Giuseppe Verdi or John Philip Sousa. But in the 22 years I've been here, there's never quite the same reaction as when you hand a young person or an older person that little box with that card that says, "Will the leader of the Marine Band see Mrs. L today?" That's really one of those magical sort of wow moments that you never get tired of. And we take care of those things, those objects, those pieces of paper, those sound recordings, those little black spots on the sheet of paper that makes music come alive. And you're going to hear a wonderful concert in the auditorium next to us, a historic auditorium. And you're going to hear those little black spots come alive in that room. And as you're listening to the music of Francis Scala, some of it that Mr. Lincoln heard himself, there's one sort of object that I can't store in our vault down in the music division across the street. I can't store the Marine Band down there. And of all the treasures we have here in Washington, of all the treasures we have here in the United States, we have one of the great musical treasures just down the street, down at 8th and I down there. And that great treasure is called the United States Marine Band. And so I hope this afternoon that you will enjoy hearing Mr. Scala's music come alive and performed by the nation's oldest continuous musical organization and one of the great treasures of this nation and the great treasures of the Library of Congress, the United States Marine Band. And if you have questions or comments, just they have the microphone sort of floating around, but feel free. We have a very smart cast up here, so.
Okay. Oh, yeah, you can hear. Okay. Thank you to all of you. Wonderful talks. Really looking forward to the concert. I have a comment and a question. I think many of us have seen the film Lincoln, and one thing that struck me is that there is a scene where he and Mary are at the theater, and if you didn't stay around for the credits, you may not know that is actually apparently a scene from Gounod's Faust that they're watching. Now, I don't know if it was historically accurate because the film period was January 1865, but it was kind of nice for me knowing that they got the spirit of that right. My question is, and I hope the Master Gunnery Sergeant will forgive this because it's about another military branch, but do any of you know, I remember reading this once in Kenneth Bernard's book on Lincoln and the music of the Civil War. Did Charles Ives's father, George Ives, who was a U.S. Army bandmaster, ever conduct a band concert on the lawn of the White House? I seem to remember reading something to that effect. I wondered if any of you knew.
Not off the top of my head, no. Sorry.
I'm not aware. There were so many bands that came through, and you know, things were a lot looser in Washington. We didn't have metal detectors and stuff, and bands would just set up, literally set up on a corner and just play a concert. And there were impromptu parades all the time. So I wouldn't doubt it, but I've never seen any proof that that happened.
I'll make a comment on your first part of your question about the movie, because I thought the movie did a pretty good job with the music it included. As far as the popular music goes, which is more my field, the inclusion of We're Coming, Father Abraham, which the band plays at the flag-raising ceremony in that scene, that's dead on. That kind of became Lincoln's theme song throughout the war, kind of losing its original connotation as a recruitment song. And the Battle Cry of Freedom scene, which is probably the most emotional musical scene in the movie after they pass the 13th Amendment, is great in that song, as I said, was one of the two major anthems of the Union, but there's no evidence that they actually sang it at that time. But that's okay. I can forgive the film. If you've read other things I've written about the film, that's my line on it, that I can forgive the film for some poetic license as long as it's well done. And I thought that was one of the best scenes in the movie, using Battle Cry of Freedom at that moment to show how exultant they were and what a big moment that was for the history of freedom in America. So.
My question is, sorry about that. You mentioned something about this composer that wrote both for the North and, his songs were sung by both North. Could you just tell me his name? I didn't get.
Oh, it's Charles Carroll Sawyer.
Thank you.
Yeah, his most famous piece is I'm drawing a When this cruel war is over, and he wrote a famous song, the name is escaping me too, about mothers that was also very popular. But yeah.
Good afternoon. I was wondering if any of you were aware, in the beginning we were told about the origin of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. According to Sergeant Floyd Worley, who was the former chief arranger of the Air Force Band, the composer of that revival song, Say Brother, Will You Join Us on Canaan's Happy Shore, was one William Stepp. Is that fictitious? Is that an apocryphal story, or is there any evidence to support that?
That is one of about 10 stories about who wrote that song. So it is a possibility. Confederate memorialists in particular liked that story because I believe Steph was from, I don't know, I can never tell because there's an E at the end of it, Steph or Steve. I think it was from South Carolina. I know he was a Southerner. But there's all kinds of evidence too that the song may have originated among African Americans at revivals. I believe the Mormons also claim the song. It's been claimed by numerous different people at numerous different times. So my as a historian looking for burden of proof, my reaction was to throw my hands up and say, basically, there's too many claims to the song for us to reliably say it belongs to anyone. So.
I just wanted to make a small comment. At Smithsonian's American Art Museum, there is a small painting. It may not be up this moment, but it is of the Prince of Wales at Mount Vernon, and an array of ladies in lovely dresses. And now I will be able to add this other little bit of that the band was there and that they raised their hats.
If you look, I don't think this.
Yeah.
If you look at that painting, if you look way back behind the trees there, you'll see Mr. Scala and the Marine Band in the corner back there.
Thank you.
They're back there with their pretty red uniform.
Great. And it was a long time before another Prince of Wales came to Washington.
You've all spoken about the importance of music during this time in our nation's history. But I wonder if you could say a word about the role, the importance of poetry at that time during the Civil War, if poetry in particular.
You know, I'll say only because of the period. You're looking at a period in time, and we see this also with music and poetry, is that people sat down and wrote poems just because they felt like doing it. And certainly songs were the same way. You had a populace, especially with music, particularly with the girls, that could, most families, if you were upwardly mobile, you bought that piano and you sent your girls off for piano lessons. But you find, in looking through the memoirs of people of that period, that the writing of poetry was something that was very common at that time, and both men and women would do that. You know, all of the memorial odes to Lincoln when he died, you know, must number into the thousands, and you look at any newspaper and magazines of the period, people wrote poems and sent them into Graham's magazine to be published, and that was certainly an almost equal way of expression, almost to music in that sense.
Well, and I'll add that the dividing line between songs and poems in the 19th century was not as fine. One of the problems I ran into researching the topic, if you're going to look at amateur stuff, is what, as was mentioned, these things are getting published in newspapers. I mean, again, something that doesn't happen a lot today, but people would send in poems and songs to newspapers, and newspapers, to show there's not this fine line, newspapers are publishing them interchangeably. I mean, to a newspaper publishing a song and a poem are essentially the same thing, and they don't make any effort to delineate between the two. So one of the more difficult problems I had was having to come up with a systematic way of delineating in my own research between a song and a poem, so I didn't mistakenly talk about the lyrics of a poem that nobody ever actually sang as compared to a song. Usually you can tell because they'll always indicate the melody it's supposed to be sung to. We'll say, you know, first, the Battle Hymn of the Republic is the most obvious example. The Battle Hymn of the Republic was published in Atlantic Monthly to the tune of John Brown's Body. I think it said to the John Brown song, but that's the song. So again, it's a much blurrier distinction in the 19th century than we would say today.
Could I just add too that this is so very true, and in the operas very often And this was true in Europe, too. You read about the operas of Verdi and Donizetti, that period. The singers would improvise, and they'd add their own lyrics sometimes. And you know the quote I read about Mrs. Lincoln hearing Robin Adair sung in La Dame Blanche. Well, that's a folk song. And a lot of times the singers would interpolate a folk piece, and then they would change the lyrics a little bit. I think one thing is always was interesting to me is how many of our popular songs were from theater works, from operas. For instance, Home Sweet Home from Clary or The Maid of Milan, which was an opera or theater piece. And I always think of Hail to the Chief. We know that that was sung originally and was from The Lady of the Lake, which was a very popular show in New York in 1812. But so that's poetry. I think it could be very improvisational to Americans at that time.
There's been quite a bit of reference to tradition among the members of the panel. Here's a question about tradition. Dr. McWhirter pointed out that over 100 years ago, when there was very little among the middle and lower middle classes, very little sophistication in terms of being able to read music and know exactly the form of the original composition. So there was a lot of improvisation around the family, and people were not criticized for doing injustice to a melody that might have originally been written in Europe. There's a paradox because now there's a lot of sophistication. Music is available. A lot of people read music, and the extent to which we're willing to pervert traditional melody in the interest of God knows what, I'm speaking personally, of course, without any hope of my views being shared by many people in the audience. But when I listen to the singing of the national anthem at the next opening of the baseball season, or at halftime, in the Super Bowl, and God forbid, at a presidential inaugural, I really have no expectation. I have no way of knowing what liberties are about to be taken in the traditional singing of our national anthem. And it really offends me as a traditionalist in that sense of the injustice that is done. Is there no limit to the liberties that we can take? I direct this question to Sergeant Ressler, who, as an instrumentalist and a historian, may from time to time be confronted with what's the Marine Band going to do in the presence of a singer who has got yet one more idea about what liberties she or he can take with something as sacred to me as our national anthem?
Well, it's an interesting question. I have developed a file in the Marine Band Library of articles and things that have been written about soloistic interpretations of the Star Spangled Banner. And it is interesting. There's a lot of very strongly held opinions, one way or the other, about the way the anthem should be performed. We do work with some great artists, either at the White House or at the request of the President of the United States. And we work with them as cooperatively as we can. Hopefully the results are pleasing to the general public. Our role is to provide music for the President of the United States, and we do that to the best of our ability. Certain things are out of our control, and certain things we maintain very careful control of, but we don't always, how shall I say, we do the best we can when the President invites a soloist to help the soloist and give the President what he was asking for.
And I'll add here, just from a historic, I do the Star Spangled Banner. And throughout the Civil War, it was back and forth for the North. Was it going to be Hail Columbia? Was it going to be the Star-Spangled Banner? The Star-Spangled Banner did not become our national anthem until 1931, when Herbert Hoover signed into law. And Congress and the President were very careful about how this law read. And there was no indication in there what key it was supposed to be in, what speed it was supposed to be played, how it was supposed to be sung. They knew what sort of treacherous waters they were getting into. So the law reads very easily and very simply. Let it be known heretofore that a piece of music known as the Star-Spangled Banner shall be the national anthem of the United States. And they let it go at that. But it's interesting, just the idea of tradition. Yankee Doodle. You know this song, my country 'tis of thee, God save our glorious King. America was a new nation, and we didn't have a lot of our own things. And when we needed something, we borrowed it or we took it. The Star-Spangled Banner, the tune we were talking about, poems being published for the first time. The first published appearance of the Battle of Fort McHenry, the Star-Spangled Banner, appeared in a Baltimore newspaper, and below it, it said, "To the tune, Anacreon in heaven," which is an English song. It is not a drinking song. If you leave today with anything, it is not a drinking song. But it was a tune that was popular at the time, and Key wrote the poem with that rhythm in his head. So when you do get into American national airs and who wrote what and when and stuff like that, it really does become almost impossible to find the links to these, because there was no one running the show. You know, it was people doing these things, singing these songs in their homes, soldiers singing these songs on the march, and it grew organically that way. That's how we got our national anthem. That's how the Marines got their Marines hymn. You know, it's from an Offenbach opera. You'll see the tune out there in the case. So it's always interesting, and it always makes for lively discussions. So.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.